began with a blocked drain in a quiet London neighborhood, but what plumbers found would shock the world. Human flesh and bones were clogging the pipes beneath an ordinary apartment. What followed exposed one of Britain's most chilling killers. A man who murdered not out of rage, but out of loneliness. Long before the smell of death seeped through the drains of a London flat, Dennis Nielsen was just a quiet boy from a small fishing town in Scotland. A boy who loved his grandfather and feared being forgotten. Born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a coastal town battered by wind and sea, his childhood was marked not by violence, but by absence. His father, a Norwegian soldier, left soon after he was born, leaving Dennis, his mother, and 2 siblings to live with relatives. The household was strict, religious, and emotionally distant. The only person who showed him real affection was his grandfather, Andrew White, a fisherman with rough hands and a gentle manner. For young Dennis, he was the embodiment of love and safety, the first and only anchor in a turbulent world. But when Dennis was 6, that anchor was ripped away. One evening, his mother told him his grandfather was gone to a better place. Hours later, she led him to the body laid out in a coffin. The old man's face was pale and still. Dennis stood frozen, unable to understand why the only person who had ever loved him was now cold and lifeless. That image, the first dead body he had ever seen, never left him. Later, he would describe it as the moment that defined his life. Death became, for him, inseparable from love. In his mind, to be dead was to be still, to stay, to never leave. As he grew, Dennis became quiet, introspective, and withdrawn. He was intelligent and artistic, but increasingly isolated. At school, he struggled to fit in. He kept to himself, harboring secret fantasies and a growing awareness of his attraction to men, something he could not share with anyone in conservative 1950s Scotland. His sexuality became a source of shame and confusion, twisting together with his early experience of death into something dark and private. When he entered adolescence, Dennis began to fantasize about control and possession. He imagined a companion who would never leave him, a silent, passive partner who could not reject or abandon him. The fantasies were harmless at first, confined to his imagination, but they hinted at a future built on loneliness and delusion. In 1961, desperate to escape Fraserburgh, Nielsen joined the British Army. He trained as a cook, a role that suited his quiet precision. The military gave him structure and identity, for a while, but it also deepened his isolation. Surrounded by men but unable to reveal who he really was, Dennis became a master of secrecy. He drank heavily, retreating further into himself. At night, he would lie awake in the barracks, watching his comrades sleep, imagining closeness he could never have. Sometimes, when they passed out drunk, he would touch them gently, not out of lust, but out of a yearning to feel connected. When they awoke, they never suspected. After 11 years of service, he left the army and drifted through a series of jobs. Police officer, security guard, civil servant. On the surface, he was polite, disciplined, unremarkable. But beneath the calm exterior, the loneliness festered. He lived alone in small flats, decorating them neatly, almost obsessively. He bought a dog for companionship, but the emptiness persisted. The world outside seemed full of people who belonged somewhere. Lovers, friends, families. Nielsen belonged to no one. During this time, his fascination with death evolved into something almost romantic. He spent hours staring at his reflection, imagining himself dead, picturing the peaceful stillness of the corpse he had seen as a boy. He later confessed that he often felt most alive when imagining death, his own or someone else's. By the late 1970s, London had become his playground and his prison. Bars and pubs in Soho were filled with young men, many homeless, drifting between night shelters and cheap rooms. They were invisible to society, and to Nielsen, they were perfect. Vulnerable, trusting, and transient. They could vanish without anyone noticing. He began inviting them home. At first, his intentions seemed harmless. He offered food, drink, a place to sleep. Some stayed the night and left in the morning. Others didn't. Nielsen's need for connection had curdled into obsession. He feared rejection above all else. To him, love meant possession, and possession meant never letting go. In his diaries, he later wrote, "If they were dead, they would stay. They would be mine forever." The transformation was complete. The lonely boy who once wept over his grandfather's body had grown into a man whose only understanding of affection came through control, death, and silence. By 1978, he had moved into a flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in North London. There, behind the curtains of an ordinary home, Dennis Nielsen would begin his descent into horror. The soldier's discipline became the killer's ritual. The quiet man from the neighborhood, always polite and reserved, was about to unleash 5 years of death and decay that would shock an entire nation. He didn't see himself as evil, only misunderstood. And in his mind, he wasn't murdering for pleasure. He was preserving love. By the late 1970s, Dennis Nielsen had become the kind of man who could vanish in a crowd. Polite, neatly dressed, forgettable. He worked as a civil servant at a job center in London, quietly helping the unemployed find work. Colleagues described him as reliable, if distant. He lived alone with his dog Bleep in a small upper-floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue, just another anonymous face in a sprawling city. Yet behind the locked door of that flat, Nielsen began a killing spree so gruesome and methodical that even hardened detectives would later call it a house of horror. The first murder happened almost by accident, or so he claimed. In December 1978, Nielsen met a young man named Stephen Holmes outside a pub. It was Christmas Eve, cold and lonely. They drank together and returned to Nielsen's flat, where they shared more drinks before falling asleep. When morning came, Nielsen felt the familiar dread, the fear of being left alone. He later told police, "I wanted him to stay. I couldn't face the emptiness." So he strangled Stephen with a necktie until his body went limp. For several hours he sat beside the corpse, talking to it as if the man were merely asleep. That night he placed the body under the floorboards. For months he would occasionally lift the loose planks to gaze at it, to feel that he still had company. It was the beginning of 5 years of death. Nielsen's method became ritual. He lured young men from pubs, bus stations, and the streets, often offering food, drink, or a place to stay. Most were drifters, runaways, or sex workers. Once inside his flat, the pattern rarely changed. They would drink, talk, and eventually fall asleep or pass out. Then, Nielsen would quietly wrap a necktie or cord around their necks and pull until the life drained from them. But the killing was only half of his compulsion. What followed was stranger and more horrifying. After the murders, Nielsen washed the bodies carefully, dressed them, and positioned them around the apartment. He sat them in armchairs, spoke to them, watched television beside them. Sometimes, he slept with the corpses in his bed, claiming that it made him feel less lonely. He treated the bodies with a grotesque tenderness. When decomposition began, he dismembered them and stored the parts in plastic bags under the floorboards or in a wardrobe. In some cases, he boiled the flesh off the bones to make disposal easier. The smell was masked by incense and the ever-burning cigarette smoke that clung to the curtains. Neighbors occasionally complained of a foul odor seeping through the walls, but Nielsen dismissed it with easy charm. "It must be the drains," he would say, smiling politely. And the neighbors believed him. By 1981, the number of victims had grown. Investigators would later estimate that between 12 and 15 young men were killed during his years on Melrose Avenue. Few were ever identified, their disappearances barely registered. They were transient, forgotten souls in Thatcher-era London.
When Nielsen moved to a new apartment at 23 Cranley Gardens in 1981, he brought his dark habits with him. The new flat, however, lacked the space for concealment. Without floorboards to hide the bodies, he turned to other methods. He dismembered his victims in the bathtub, boiled the remains, and flushed what he could down the toilet or burned it in the garden. The horror unfolded quietly, right beneath the feet of unsuspecting neighbors. In his new home, the killings continued, quieter, faster, more mechanical. But even Nielsen's control was beginning to unravel. The loneliness that drove him to murder had not vanished. It had deepened. Each death brought a fleeting calm, followed by emptiness and disgust. He began drinking heavily, slipping into blackouts. His conversations with the corpses, once soothing, turned into arguments with voices that existed only in his mind. Still, he maintained his facade. Each morning he put on his suit, walked to work, and sat behind a desk at the job center, counseling the unemployed. No one suspected a thing. To his co-workers, he was a bit odd but harmless. They could never have imagined that their quiet colleague spent his nights dismembering bodies in his bathtub. The end came, not through police brilliance, but through plumbing. In February 1983, tenants in the Cranley Gardens building began complaining about clogged drains. The plumber who arrived to investigate expected the usual grease and debris. Instead, when he opened the access pipe, he found something that looked disturbingly like human flesh. The next day, police were called. When they examined the fragments, a pathologist confirmed the impossible. They were human remains. Officers traced the blockage to Nielsen's top-floor apartment. When they knocked on his door, he appeared calm and courteous, even helpful. He invited them inside, offered tea, and when asked about the discovery, he simply said, "It's a long story. You'd better come in." That night, Dennis Nielsen confessed to everything. He spoke for hours, describing the murders with chilling detachment. He told them where to find the remains, how he had disposed of them, and even the names of some of his victims. "I loved them," he said softly. "I couldn't let them leave me." Detectives left the flat in stunned silence. They had entered looking for a broken drain and uncovered one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. The horror of what lay beneath London's ordinary streets was finally revealed. A 5-year reign of death carried out by a man who wanted only one thing: never to be alone again. When the police walked out of 23 Cranley Gardens in February 1983, the air in Muswell Hill seemed to hang heavy with disbelief. For hours, detectives had stood in that small, tidy flat, surrounded by the remnants of horror no one could have imagined. Bags of bones, boiled skulls, fragments of flesh. The stench clung to everything. And in the center of it all, Dennis Nielsen calmly recounted his crimes as though reading a diary. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J., who led the case, later said, "He was polite, articulate, almost relieved. You got the feeling he had been waiting for us." That night, Nielsen was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. But unlike other killers, he didn't try to deny or evade. He wanted to talk.
Over the following days, he gave full confessions, long, detailed, chillingly precise. He described each murder, the rituals that followed, and how he disposed of the bodies. He even drew diagrams to help police locate remains at his previous address on Melrose Avenue. He didn't appear proud or ashamed. He simply spoke. At one point, an investigator asked him why he did it. Nielsen looked up and said softly, "I wanted them to stay. I couldn't bear them leaving." The confession filled more than 200 pages. It was not the statement of a raving madman, but of an intelligent, emotionally detached man trying to rationalize the irrational. He admitted to killing as many as 15 men, though he couldn't remember all their names. To him, they were companions who stopped breathing. Forensic teams spent weeks excavating his former home, uncovering bags of remains buried beneath the floorboards. The grim evidence shocked even seasoned pathologists. "It was like opening a tomb," one officer said, except the tomb was someone's living room. As the case moved toward trial, the British press descended on the story. Headlines screamed, "Monster of Muswell Hill," "The Kindly Killer," "The Man Who Talked to the Dead." Reporters camped outside the courthouse, fighting for every detail. The public couldn't look away. How could a man who looked so ordinary commit such extraordinary evil? When Nielsen appeared in the Old Bailey in October 1983, the courtroom was packed. Dressed neatly in a suit, he stood calm and attentive, his voice even as he entered his plea. Not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His defense argued that he was insane, that his actions were driven by severe personality disorder and loneliness, not by malice. Psychiatrists testified that he suffered from a deep disconnection between emotion and empathy, describing him as a man trapped between self-hatred and self-love. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They portrayed Nielsen as a manipulative narcissist, fully aware of his actions, who killed for control, not compassion. They pointed out how methodical he had been, how he cleaned the bodies, how he hid evidence, how he lied to neighbors. This, they argued, was not madness. It was calculation. The testimony was excruciating. Jurors listened to weeks of forensic reports, crime scene photographs, and Nielsen's own recordings. Through it all, he remained impassive, occasionally taking notes or correcting minor details, as if helping the court document his own crimes. On November 4th, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. The judge, Mr. Justice Croom Johnson, sentenced him to life imprisonment, recommending that he serve a minimum of 25 years. Later, Home Secretary Michael Howard would change that to a whole life tariff, ensuring that Dennis Nielsen would die behind bars. As he was led away, Nielsen turned to the court and said quietly, "Thank you, my lord." Inside prison, he became both a curiosity and a pariah. Inmates called him Des. He spent his days writing memoirs, drawing, and corresponding with journalists. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood soul, fascinated by death but not evil. "I am not a monster," he wrote once. "I am a man who could not face being alone." But the public saw something else, a predator hiding behind intellect and civility. His interviews over the years were chilling in their composure. He spoke of his victims as if they were sleeping, insisting that he killed not for pleasure but to preserve. "They were mine," he said in one televised statement. "In death, they stayed." For criminologists, Nielsen became a case study in the psychology of control and emotional paralysis. His crimes blurred the line between necrophilia and narcissism, between loneliness and domination. He wasn't driven by rage or lust, but by a desperate pathological need for possession. Even in death, his influence lingered. The case forced British society to confront uncomfortable truths about homelessness, about the invisibility of young men in the gay community, and about how easily loneliness can mutate into monstrosity. Dennis Nielsen died in prison in May 2018, at the age of 72. He was found lying in his cell, alone, just as he had lived. When news of his death broke, there was no public mourning, no vigil, only a quiet sigh of closure. Yet for those who remembered the horror that began with a blocked drain, the story of the kindly killer remained a haunting reminder of what can hide behind politeness, behind normalcy, behind the neighbor who always seemed so ordinary. Evil, it seemed, didn't always scream. Sometimes it spoke softly and offered you a drink.